Lord, thank you for being with us here today. As we talk about conflict, we ask just for the same thing David does in his psalm, simply that you would search us, O God, and know our hearts, that you would try us and know our thoughts, that you would see if there's any grievous way inside of us, and lead us in the way everlasting. In your name, amen. All right, so today we're going through Wise Communication Part 2, and the overall theme here is conflict. So we'll be looking at offense, quarrel, and strife. And you can see I've included the image from last time. So what we're working through today is the 4 principles of communication. We'll run through those probably a little quicker than last time. And touch on those. Then we'll look at introduction to conflict, introduce the broad topic and break it down. And then we'll run into the individual topics from Proverbs. So offense, then quarreling, and then strife. And then we'll do a wrap up, and I'll try to save some time for discussion. There's a lot, so I might not be able to, but I'm hoping to have some time for that. All right, first thing, the 4 principles of communication. If you remember last time I had 3. I'd been thinking of a 4th one, but hadn't gotten to it, so I was able to include that at the end this time. So our first principle is there's 2 parts of communication. There's both listening and speaking. We see in James, he emphasizes this when he says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear and slow to speak, slow to anger." And that puts us with that listening on one side and speaking on the other in order to really have full communication. The second principle is that the heart is the core. Now Jesus talks about this in a long passage, but I'm just looking at the very end since we saw it last time. And he says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so what I'm summarizing here from him is that really the heart is in the center of this communication of any of us. So when we listen, there's hearing when you hear something, but to really listen, it's coming in and you're considering it within you. And the heart here represents more than just emotions. It's your mind, it's how you think about things, it's the whole being that causes you to do any action or perform any action. So the listening, it comes into the heart, and then the speaking is the overflow from the heart. So that comes out from there and gives you an idea of the source. So if you are full of praise internally and really excited about something, that will start to come out of your speech. If you're really upset or angry or hateful, that sort of bitterness or something will start to enter your speech as well and overflow out. So that's the concept here of the heart in the center. And so this kind of is the main 2 principles. And then we have 2 more principles, one for speaking and one for listening in terms of how to go about it. Oh, let me just say this, because I really enjoy this. From Proverbs, talking about the heart again, it says, "The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out." And this is an important concept for us to understand. We don't necessarily know what's in our own hearts, so as we go into conflict, that's going to come up. I know just 2 weeks ago, I came home from Monday. I was working on Monday, my wife was off, and she put away a bunch of the stuff we got from our baby shower. People were very generous, and so there were lots of boxes she was putting stuff away. I get home, and she's pretty much finished all of it, and she lets me know, and I suddenly feel very hurt. And then I feel very frustrated that I'm hurt, because it seems totally random. And I want to say something like, "Why'd you do that?" or something like that. Thankfully, I caught that before it went into speaking, and I caught it in the heart. But I was confused. I didn't know what was necessarily coming from. And I realized I was just feeling like I was feeling left out. I'm not carrying the child. I haven't got much interaction. So I'm like, oh, I'm just feeling a bit left out. Once I realized that, it makes sense that I was like, oh, I'm not a part of that too. I'm missing out a little bit. So that's just, for me, that realization that I have things in there I don't know. And when things come up, you find out what's actually in there. So a good thing to keep in mind as we go into the conflict discussion. All right, so the principle 3 is on the speech side. So this is building others up, and this is from Ephesians. So let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. So whenever we speak, we want to make sure that our speech doesn't tear down, but rather builds others up. And this is a good principle or check on anything we say. If it's something that's tearing down, we want to avoid that. But it could be something like praise, where you're saying, hey, that's a very good job. I want to mark that and encourage that. It could also be some corrective action, where you want to build them up by removing something that might be bad, or notifying them that, hey, there's an issue that is hindering you, and I want you to thrive more. So that could come across in a way that's, a conflict sort of style, but it could be for their benefit, is what you're focusing on. And then our last one here for listening is seek knowledge. Now this may seem a little strange, and I'll put a little context to it. So the verse I'm using here, and it comes up a ton in Proverbs, which is my main text, is an intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. Now, what is Solomon talking about here? When I come to this verse, I usually think, when someone says, hey, gain knowledge, I usually think like, oh, I'll read a book, right? Or maybe I'll take a class and learn more. But in these days, in Solomon's days, his context, there were only a couple spots to gain knowledge, right? There was some laws that were written down. There were some scripture they had, the Torah, perhaps other things. And then the only other spot was praying to God or talking with other individuals. So when he's talking about seeking knowledge, a lot of it, especially in the interactions in Proverbs, is talking to the other person, learning what's inside them, learning how they think or what they've learned from events in their life. And that's going to be a core part of the discussion later on. So this is kind of my depiction of it, is kind of the heart being an entrance to a cave, and we're trying to enter that cave and try to search around and understand the other person, and also understand ourselves. Both hearts, we don't see everything, nobody knows everything, but we're trying to understand each other more, and that's a key part of the listening. And the other part is that God is omniscient, and he actually knows the entirety of your heart and the other person, even if we don't understand our own. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. Prayer is a good part of this. Learning in his word a little bit more as well can help bring forth things in your heart that you didn't see or in others. So it's an encouraging thing to know that he knows it as well. All right, so that's our 4 principles. I'll put them here: the listening and speaking, the heart, and then building others up, as well as seeking knowledge. All right, let's jump into the conflict introduction. So before we talk about the biblical conflict and things there, I just want to bring something up that's been helpful to me. And my wife taught me this acronym, and it's been helpful. But before you go into a conflict, just from my own experience in the human wisdom, it's been helpful for me to use the acronym HALT, and to note if I'm hungry or angry or lonely or tired. because the emotion I feel or the reaction I have, it is real. Sometimes people can say, oh, that's just because you're hungry. And I haven't seen that to be true myself. I haven't seen anything that indicates that. So what you're feeling is a reaction to something that maybe happened before or recently. But being hungry, being tired, things like that can make it really hard to work through it. So it's good to check this and maybe have the discussion after you ate as opposed to before you ate, or in the morning after full sleep as opposed to right before you go to bed when you're really tired. So things like that can help with conflict. This isn't in the Bible. This is just something from experience to bring up, and something I'm not covering in the rest of it as we move forward. So yeah, just wanted to add that in there. So the 3 levels of conflict. Now these are the 3 words we had before. And with offense, this is that single offense. It's kind of that, I depict it as an arrow here because it feels, you kind of feel it come into you, that one event that occurred, and either somebody said something or somebody did something and you're offended by it. It's that single event that occurred to you. A quarrel differs in the way that it's 2 people arguing back and forth and it's really heated. So this is kind of a single event between 2 people. On a lot of like comedy sketches and stuff, it'll be like husband and wife or friends or siblings quarreling, arguing back and forth, and it's very intense. So that's kind of the quarrel area. And then in the strife is a kind of bigger conflict. So this is a long-term state where you and possibly the other person have gotten a rivalry, and that may cause offenses, that may cause quarrels, but the problem isn't the thing you're arguing about. It's something deeper and more intense that's causing these things to come up. So that's kind of the 3 levels, and it's not a progression, right? You don't first offend and then quarrel and then strife. They interact with each other. So you could jump from offense to strife. You could start with strife and it could cause the other things. But this just gives the levels of conflict we see. And then in terms of quarrel, I wanted to give kind of definitions of what I'm talking about here. So there's a discussion, which is exploring a topic, and there's no sides. So the goal is really just learning about the topic. Maybe we're talking about birds, and nobody has any opinions. We're just, hey, what type of birds? Different things like that. The next would be an argument, and this is where we're having open reasoning for or against something. But the goal here is finding the best path. We're not saying, I have to be right. We're saying, I think I'm right, but I want to hear what you say, and we're trying to both find the best path. And then when we go up to quarrel, that's this loud or forceful convincing, and this will come in later when we get a better definition of quarrel later on. But the goal here tends to be to force them to agree with me. It's that kind of you've anchored down and you're like, I'm right, and I'm just waiting for them to admit that I'm right. So I'm just going to keep going until that happens. And from the outside, you can look and see it's not going anywhere if both people are waiting for that. So that's kind of the levels I'll be talking about today. All right, so with that all summarized, let's jump into the first topic, and that is offense. So what is offense? Let's look at the definition. So the definition of offense is to displease, to make angry, to affront. So we've been there where someone says something and you're like, oh man, that was pretty pointed, that hurt. And that's what we're talking about here. So when we think about the state of being offended or state of offense, I like to go to Proverbs 18. It says, "A brother offended is more unyielding than a strong city, and quarreling is like the bars of a castle." So what happens when we're offended is really this. You get hit by that arrow, right? And then you turn into a strong city. If any of you have been offended before, you feel that like hunkered down, oh no, they didn't. And that's kind of what's going on. And sometimes you don't realize you're offended and you stopped listening, or the person across from you suddenly stopped listening to you. And you're like, wait, I think something happened and I don't know when it happened. So this is helpful for us so we know, oh, I'm getting that feeling. I think I've been offended. It's something we need to address before we can go on, or something like that. So how do we respond to an offense when this happens? Well, Proverbs gives us two different ways. So the first one in Proverbs 19 says, "Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense." So the first thing we can do is really this. When that kind of aggressive thing comes in at us, is let it pass by. Now, we can't always do that, but there might be minor ones in which we can, we hear that come at us and we think, you know what? They're just a little bit tired, or, they're upset, or, oh, maybe I was wrong. Let me check that out. And maybe we can sidestep that arrow and let that go past. So that's the first thing, is overlooking something that comes at you, right? And that would solve it. That would be really nice. But it isn't always possible. So we look at the second way to work with offense. Proverbs 17 says, "Whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends." Now, when we first come to this, you may think, oh, if I'm offended, I just need to cover it up and not talk about it, right? And if you just took this out of the Bible, you might come to that conclusion. But if we look at the whole Bible, whenever we look at covering an offense, this is really engaging in conflict resolution. You talk with a person about it, and then once you've resolved it with them, you cover it and you don't repeat it. It's now been dealt with. And so this is kind of my depiction of that offended state. And when you're in that offended state and your heart is a strong city, the concept here is just sending an ambassador, saying something, hey, could we pause for a moment? Because something you said really hurt, and I'm struggling to listen. If we could work through that real quick. Or my wife and I sometimes use like a couple hours or day. If we're still thinking about things and a couple hours later, we may not have overlooked it. It may still be in there. So then we'll bring it up again and say, hey, could we talk about something that happened? And that's helpful for us. So that's kind of the two ways to respond. So it's a nice short couple verses here. The other ones are longer. But here's kind of the summary of offense, right? So offense ends up locking down the heart. And then the ways to respond healthily are to overlook the initial offense, or to seek reconciliation and cover it, not repeat it. So that's the summary of offense. All right. Let's jump into the next one, which is quarrel. All right, so this is a little bit different, right? It's an argument that's gone past the limit and now is into that kind of fighting range. So the definition that we have is to dispute violently or with loud and angry words, to wrangle, to scold. So it's a very aggressive argumentation between two people. And I think, I've seen it on shows, you see it sometimes, it can happen. I've seen it at the workplace, see it at home. it happens where people are quarreling. And again, as we teach through this, this doesn't mean we'll never have offense or quarreling or strife again in our lives. That's not a reasonable expectation. We're all sinners. It's going to come up. But we're hoping to find ways to navigate it better. And when you're in the middle of it, recognize it and then find a better path than some of the ones that we may use. So what is the state of quarreling kind of like, right? Let's help us recognize the signs. So we have 3 proverbs here, and I'll go through and then we'll summarize. We have the beginning of strife is like letting out water, so quit before the quarrel breaks out. Here's that image of, kind of a dam breaking and the water letting out, and so it escalates and it gets worse and worse. So that's one part of it. Another part is a brother offended is more unyielding than a strong city. That was our previous focus. And quarreling is like the bars of a castle. So this is kind of the image of the proverb. So not only does it quickly escalate, but it also doesn't result in any progress. Quarreling creates bars of a castle around our heart. And really, it prevents that entrance or exit, right? If you're going into a castle or something like that, if somebody puts down the gate, now nobody can go in or out of the castle. And so quarreling creates that. Now there's no listening. Listening's shut down, and so no progress can be made because nothing's being taken in. And instead, there's kind of arrows being shot out toward the speech. It's become more aggressive. So that's the state of quarreling, the shutdown of listening, no progress being made, and kind of the escalation during it. The other thing that Proverbs talks about is a quarrelsome person. And this comes up, I think, 4, maybe 5 times throughout Proverbs. And something that I need to address before we jump into the verses is this question here, is why are these mostly about wives? There are 3 that say wives, 1 that says living with a quarrelsome woman, and 1 that talks about a quarrelsome man, right? So first off, quarreling is not gender specific, and it's not marriage specific. You don't quarrel more if you're a certain gender. You don't quarrel more if you're married versus unmarried. That's not what any of this says. In fact, in the New Testament, there's more verses about men and addressing that than there is about addressing women. So it balances out with the whole of Scripture even. So we need to go back to kind of the context, right? Who is the speaker? Who's the person putting these proverbs down? We know there's a couple people writing proverbs in Proverbs, but these are all from King Solomon. And King Solomon is recorded to have 600 wives. So that's like having a wife, marrying someone every month for the rest of your life. It's an insane number of wives. And so if someone has had quarreling wives, it's probably him in the 600 that he's had. So that's our first part. He's the speaker. And then the second part is, who is the audience, right? As we look at the first verses in Proverbs, we see him repeat over 20 times, my son or my sons. So the big part of the audience here is young men, particularly his sons, who are going to be king. And so you can see as a father, he's telling them, hey, quarrelsome women are not worth it. Avoid that trait. It's kind of the warning sons about marrying quarrelsome women. So that's kind of the context we're in. So that helps us come to the verses with an understanding of what he's trying to communicate a little bit better, potentially. All right, so now that we've got our context, let's jump into the number of verses here. So our first verse is, a foolish son is ruin to his father, and a wife's quarreling is a continual dripping of rain. So the first thing we get is being with someone who is quarrelsome is there's this continuous negative part to it, right? And the dripping of rain is difficult to understand where he's going. Thankfully, the next proverb expands upon this a little bit. So Hezekiah wrote down some of Solomon's proverbs, and thankfully he wrote down this one, which says, "A continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. To restrain her is to restrain the wind, or to grasp oil in one's right hand." So this is talking about anyone who's quarrelsome. They can't be restrained. If they're argumentative, if they just want to bring up, things over and over and want to get in fights, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to stop them from continuing on, right? That's one of the traits of the quarreling. So, yeah, that's what I wrote here, the unable to be restrained. So that's one of the traits here. The second verse, or third verse, says, "As charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a quarrelsome man for kindling strife." So the next thing we learn is this person who is quarrelsome ends up creating those larger battles. They keep quarreling, they keep arguing, and it causes the large strife to occur between different people, maybe them, maybe others. But that's a cause of this. Another one is, "It is better to live in the corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife." And the second one, "It is better to live in a desert land than with a quarrelsome and fretful woman." So Solomon again is telling his sons, it's wearisome to live with someone who is quarrelsome. So when you look for a wife, and they're quarrelsome, it doesn't matter if they're pretty, if they're, rich or politically powerful. If they're quarrelsome, maybe go a different way. Maybe put that person aside and keep looking. It's better to live alone in the desert than to pursue someone who is quarrelsome. And that's kind of probably what he's coming to with these proverbs toward his sons. So the response here is, if there's someone like that, and not to form a partnership if that's what things are going toward. If it's going toward marriage, not to be careful with that. Maybe it's a job, or you guys are forming a company, whatever it is. Be careful of people that are constantly quarreling. All right, and the last part here is, how do we navigate quarreling? And we have three things for this one. So the first proverb says, "Whoever meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears." So what does this mean? What is the passing dog here? Dogs in those days weren't pets. I remember I was on a mission trip in Mexico, and there was a dog kind of in the street. And I'm used to all the dogs being pets, just loose. And my mom telling me, no, don't approach that dog. We need to keep our distance because we don't know what that dog is like. He lives on the streets. It's a different setting. So that's likely the dog we're talking about here. And you can imagine if you went up to that dog and grabbed it by the ear, you're in really big trouble. You're not going to look good after you do that. And that's the metaphor here for jumping into a quarrel that you had no part in. So the lesson is to not jump into a quarrel that is someone else's. And I read this when I was like 13, and I quarreled with my siblings quarreled, and at that time I would, as big brother, jump in and try to help. Oh, I know the argument they need. I'd jump in, and then it would just get worse, because again, no one's listening. I'm not helping anything. So I read this, and then I worked really hard not to jump into quarrels, and then I wasn't in trouble, and the relationship with all my siblings got better because I wasn't jumping into their arguments. Nobody wants that with Big Brother. So this is really helpful for me that I was just causing my own pain, could stop doing that. All right, so the next proverb says, the lot puts an end to quarrels and decides between powerful contenders. So if you're in a spot where you need to decide something that doesn't matter as much, and it's just difficult to decide, this is a possibility. I haven't seen this. I rarely do anything like this, but you could decide it with chance. There's two different ways to go. You could use chance and agree like, hey, we'll just do whatever the coin flip is, and we'll call it good, and we'll move on because we need to keep going. So that's an option here. The last option comes from Proverbs 17, and it says, the beginning of strife is like the letting out of water, so quit before the quarrel breaks out. And this is one of the best responses in quarreling, is to restrain yourself. The one thing you can control is your own reactions, what you're saying. And so that self-restraint, when it starts to get heated and turn things around, is really important. If you can say, hey, let's pause. I think this is getting a little too heated for me. I'm not listening as well, something like that. Some way to pause the argument so that you can come down off of quarreling and back into listening. Also, noting that you have jumped into quarreling and turning around and asking a question so that you start to get the listening back online. So if you kind of lift that gate up a little bit and let a little bit of what they're saying in for a time, you may help the quarrel move back down into an argument. So even if they're heated, you might be able to bring them down by listening for a time and restore that open listening and communication back and forth. So yeah, that's what we have on quarreling. All right. I know it's a lot. There's a lot of things coming at us. It's very Proverbs where you get hit with strong things multiple times. So looks like you guys are doing well with the reactions I'm getting, which is good. All right, now we're heading into strife. And again, this is that long-term conflict between two individuals and causes other things. So it's a bit deeper of a conflict we're talking about here. So for the definition of strife, we have exertion or contention for superiority, either by intellectual or physical efforts. So a good example of strife is actually Saul and David. Remember when Saul learns that David's going to be the next king? Then for the rest of Saul's life, he has strife against David. Now this strife, David isn't doing anything to cause the strife. This is what Saul is causing. And in his case, this is a physical, mostly, strife. He's coming and he's attacking, he's pursuing, trying to kill David. So this is a physical strife. But in our case, it's likely a more intellectual. It's verbal, it's social positioning. It's something of that, in that direction. So what is the state of strife? And again, we've seen this in a couple verses, so they'll come back. But we have the Proverbs 17, which says the beginning of strife is like letting out water. So quit before the quarrel breaks out. So again, that kind of rushing, that dam breaking, and when strife starts, and it gets worse and worse, and strife just continues to escalate. We also see in Proverbs 20, it is an honor for a man to keep aloof from strife, but every fool will be quarreling. So when you see strife, or it's going to happen, to keep away from it is important. Otherwise, you're going to be foolishly quarreling. It's causing that. And then the comparison here, better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. really that comparison between it's better to be poor but have peace than to have feast all the time but a constant strife between everyone you're with. And I think we've experienced that. We'd rather just have peace than anything else, usually. So here's our state of strife, kind of putting those three into a couple bullet points. So it quickly escalates. It's the cause of foolish quarreling. And strife is worse than poverty, is our comparison that we have from the proverb. So clearly this is very bad, like most of the other things we talked about. And Proverbs has two things it goes through. First, we're going to look at who should we be who should we be wary of to avoid strife and quarreling. And that might be something that we've become ourselves, or might be someone that we're listening to. And then after that, we'll talk about kind of the source within our own hearts for strife. So first, who should we be wary of? We have Proverbs 16 that says, a dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends. So the first, there's two verses. I forgot. And it says, for lack of wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no whisperer, quarreling ceases. So the first character we need to be aware of is the whisperer. And the whisperer is someone who spreads negative stories. Now that could be us, and we could be causing our own strife by doing this. We could also be listening to someone who's constantly talking negatively about someone around us. So it's a spot to be wary of, because I had a coworker that would constantly talk about his conflict with the boss or my boss's boss, and that constant telling me, they did this to me, it was awful, it was bad. It affected my relationship with them and made me distrust them, even though I had no reason to distrust them. So it caused some strife and some distance between me and the other person just because I was constantly listening to them and taking their stuff on to be my battle. And so that's something to be aware of. Don't take on other people's, conflict continuously to become your own battle. They should be resolving and working through their own conflict. Now, if there's abuse, if there's big problems, it's good to help people. But some people just try to create problems between you and another. And that's kind of what we want to avoid. The next character we saw last time. So drive out a scoffer, and strife will go out, and quarreling and abuse will cease. So a scoffer is someone who speaks with contempt of others. So if we're listening to scoffing a lot, we can end up becoming very contemptuous toward an individual, and that itself causes strife between us and them. We don't listen to them. We'll end up fighting them for reasons that don't make sense to us. So that's another person that can cause strife in our relationships. And then we also have Proverbs 26, as charcoal to hot embers and fire to wood, so is a quarrelsome man for kindling strife. So that's that quarrelsome person from before who's always arguing. And we've probably seen this and seen the constant strife and the constant separation between people and fighting that occurs with this person around. So again, that person is a cause of strife. And then our last person here, a man of wrath stirs up strife, and one given to anger causes much transgression. So this is that wrathful person, someone who's angry all the time, just kind of attacks all the time. Again, that'll cause a lot of distance, and we could take that on accidentally and start to fight when it's not our battle. So those are the four individuals to kind of be wary of and be, careful how you're interacting or what's coming into you. The last verse here is about kind of a behavior or an approach. So I included this in the external causes area. It says, for pressing milk produces curds, pressing the nose produces blood, and pressing anger produces strife. So the last thing here is an action to avoid, and it's really pushing someone who's angry. I think we've been there where someone's angry with us, and you can decide to kind of walk away or go a different path or keep pressing and pressing and pressing. And what they're saying here is if you keep doing that, you're going to cause that level of strife between you two, that long-term conflict to possibly come up and instill itself in the relationship. So, yeah, those are the external causes and an action. It's a lot of talking. Take a drink real quick. All right, so hopefully that gives you clarity when you're in some of those situations. And the last thing here we're going to talk about today is what are the main sources of strife and their solutions. And this is going to really talk more about our own hearts. What's inside of our hearts causing the strife, and how do we navigate that? Because we don't want conflict. If we can find a way to resolve it and solve it permanently, that would be the best way to go. So let's look at our first verse. We have hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses. So we have two sides to it, right? When we are hating someone else, that ends up causing division, and it ends up causing fights with other people. So this is kind of my image for it as I continue talking about it. But on the right side, we have the kingdom of hate. So when you have that hatred, and I've had this before where there was a couple offenses, and I used those offenses as my reasons for hating someone. And once I had lodged that hate within me, everything they did, I would attack. I'm like, oh, it's like a kingdom where there's this border drawn, and every time they stepped across the border, I would fight. I would engage. I would attack. And it wasn't anything they were doing. Many of those had nothing to do with it. But, and this is like a work relationship, anytime they had an idea that was different than mine, that was getting in my kingdom, and I would attack them because that was different. And at the end of the day, I hadn't resolved an offense, and I hadn't resolved that hatred that I had inside for that individual. And that was causing all my issues, was that deep hate for the individual. So instead of that, and what I've worked on for a couple people that I struggled with, is working toward loving them, right? Love covers offenses. Love covers all offenses. So sometimes I could talk with them. Sometimes I couldn't talk with them because we aren't in connection anymore, or the other person is a little more abusive and it doesn't work. But on my side, to get to the point where I wasn't hating them, and I was getting to the point I could pray for them. Hey, I'm praying that the things that they're working through would be better, stuff like that. So that's my own kind of journey in this specific issue that I've dealt with. But trying to, if you have that spot where you're fighting for no reason, it might be a deeper issue to look at. And if you can start working through that with someone else and with God, it'll help prevent some of that strife that you're having, the kingdom mentality. The second out of 4 is a greedy man stirs up strife, but the one who trusts in the Lord will be enriched. So the second kingdom you could have is one of greed. And I think this may be where Saul was at, right? When Saul was fighting David, it wasn't, David didn't do anything. He was singing his harp, he was fighting great battles, but Saul had some possibly hate of David from his fame, and he also had potentially greed from David taking over his kingdom and it not passing on to his son Jonathan. So that caused Saul to hunker down, and at every point he attacked David because in his heart you have hate and greed saying, let's go to war. This guy's the enemy. And instead, what we try to transition to, if we see that greed in our heart, is a trust of God's provision, that he has given us what we need, that maybe it's not a kingdom, maybe it's something someone else has or has taken from us, and a trust that God's provision is enough for us and that we don't need to engage and take something that we don't currently have. So that's kind of the transition over to the left side. It's different on the screen. The third one is from Proverbs 13. By insolence comes nothing but strife, but with those who take advice is wisdom. Now, insolence is this arrogant behavior where you aren't listening to anybody, and instead you're telling everyone what to do and trying to kind of force it upon them. So we may have seen this, someone's very arrogant, and you can say whatever you want, the person's not hearing it, and instead they're just bossing everyone around, telling them what to do, telling them why they're wrong. It's kind of that arrogant behavior. So again, if we see that in ourselves, that listening is happening, that we're being very bossy or something, and we realize that's where we are, to try to transfer into that humble listening. And like most of these conflicts, having a bit of listening in there is part of the first step of resolving the conflict situation. All right, and the last one we have, Proverbs 15. A hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. So the last one on our list is that hot temper. It could be for a variety of reasons, right? But if you notice that your heart is there and just you're getting angry at every single thing, that's of course going to cause a lot of distance between you guys. It's going to cause a lot of fights with whoever you're dealing with. And so working to slow the anger, see if you can make a longer time between when something happens and when you get angry. That'll help reduce some of the strife that occurs, kind of the distance. So that's kind of the full view of strife that we have from Proverbs. So let me pause for a second here for some water. All right, we're looking like we have about 10 minutes left. So we're going to do a quick wrap-up so that we can look at the summary of what we've seen so far. And then I'll open it up for discussions, questions, and thoughts. So going back to the principles, we have both listening and speaking, and the heart being the center of it. We have on the speaking side, we want to be building people up and not tearing them down when we speak with them. And then on the listening side, we want to be seeking knowledge and seeking learning both about them and about our own hearts. In terms of conflict, we have our first one being offense, which is that single arrow that comes in, and causes the heart to lock down. So we don't seek to offend. If something comes against us, we try to overlook it. And if we can't overlook it, we try to reconcile and forgive. Second one was quarreling, and that's that castle, the bars of the castle in front of the heart. So don't jump into a quarrel that isn't yours. Don't jump into somebody else's fight. That'll solve the problem right there. Stop the quarrel. If you know you're getting up into the quarreling and the fighting area, to stop and come back to it later is helpful way. And then again, restoring that listening, seeking the knowledge, is a good way to come from quarreling back down to arguing. Hard to do when you're heated in it, but it can be very helpful. And then our last one is strife. And here we want to be cautious with scoffers, whisperers, with those who are quarrelsome or those who are wrathful, because that can cause us to have unnecessary strife arguments with people, with others, and affect our relationships. We also don't want to be these people. These are people to avoid being. And then the last one, I'm going to throw the whole image here, is really that looking into your own heart when arguments don't make sense, or you seem to react what seems irrationally, and see if that's coming from something really deep within you, like hate or greed, that arrogance, the insolence, or hot temper. And then if it is, transfer over and try to work toward loving your enemy, trusting what God has given you, humbly listening to those around you, or slowing down the progression toward anger. All right, it's a big summary, but I'm going to open up for any thoughts and questions, and I think Jesse in the back has the mic. So, yeah, Kevin.
How is inserting yourself into a quarrel different from giving advice, godly advice from others, or even offering mediation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So how is jumping into a quarrel not your own different from being a mediator or being someone giving advice on the side? I think a big part is you're not invited, maybe part of it. So a mediator is usually invited into it. Two people are having an argument. They turn to a friend and say, hey, can you help us out? We're having trouble solving this. What are we missing? So the invitation in is the difference between a mediator and jumping into the quarrel like I did with my siblings. They did not ask me. They did not want me. And then advice giver, I think, again, it might be a little bit of invitation or openness. So it might be helpful to give advice when they're not in the argument and later on separately. You could talk to one separately or another separately if they're in a listening state. So that might be a good difference between those three options. Yeah.
I was curious if you have any thoughts on if there's any nuance or differences when this stuff's happening in the workplace versus, in your personal life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Difference between workplace and personal life. In the workplace, for me, I can say, because I'm an employee and I have a boss and stuff, in the conflicts, I've noticed it's a little different because at the end of the day, I'm paid to serve somebody else. So I have a little less skin in the game in some ways. So I had a conflict with a colleague. We were kind of getting into the circles. We weren't angry, but we were close, and we weren't listening. And so in that state, I could talk to my boss, and we said, hey, boss, both of us came to him and said, could you decide between us what the option is? And he actually came up with a third option. He resolved it and said, hey, you keep doing your thing. We're going to add funding for him to do his thing, and we're all good. So that was helpful for me. And again, it's kind of, they may go a way I don't like with the decision. I am paid to do what they want me to do, so it's a little bit different. So that's kind of what I've seen there. Also, I can change jobs, which has happened. So those are some thoughts there. On the home front, I feel like my emotions can be bigger, and it's a bigger problem for me, just because it's my actual life. If I have an argument with my wife and we're working through something, it's going to be how it is for potentially decades. So it's something I want to spend a little bit more time on. I think being patient and knowing when to pull someone in. It's harder with that one too, because there's no authority structure with my wife. Like, it's my wife and I, and then who is it? So I think it's harder to pull in someone into that. A good friend or a pastor. Pastor can be helpful because that's a little bit authority-ish and can be help in that relationship. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on it, at least. Hopefully it's helpful. Yeah.
Andrew, I really like, how you laid out what Proverbs said, and these pictures, I'm just, if we could have like them framed on a wall or something, that's cool. Could be helpful, right? One thing I really appreciate, and you can even see it in those drawings, is how you keep the heart in the center of all those Proverbs, which is what the author's trying to do and what God's helping us do, because a lot of this, it seems like it's making us aware of dynamics that are there. And with quarreling and strife, something that can feel weird to us is it's saying put distance in between yourself and another person. Mm-hmm. And then we hear that as Christians and we think about, but wait a minute, aren't we supposed to love? And so we can feel this tension, I think, sometimes. Like, love equals not having distance. Love equals, that could almost be like being unwise towards them, is what Proverbs would say. But it's helpful with the heart part, I think, because even though you may be putting distance between yourself and someone who's quarrelsome or a scoffer, the Bible's still calling us to have that heart of love, like you mentioned, like still being able to like pray for them and stuff like that. Right. So yeah. I find that's helpful for myself when I feel uncomfortable with the wisdom Proverbs calls us to of like distance. But then knowing that heart thing is there then situates it within Christ-likeness as well. Yeah. So I guess that's mostly a comment, but also thank you, and I don't know if you have any thoughts. So.
Thanks. Yeah, like it sounds like what you're talking about is the difference between the attitude towards someone and your relational closeness. Yeah. And like those individuals, you want to have a farther relationship, you don't get as close to them, and that isn't not loving, it's just more appropriate, but to be a loving person for them in the moments where they need a little bit more and they're more open. Yeah, it's a good distinction. Distance doesn't always mean not loving. It's attitude of heart versus your relational status-ish. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Could you explore the idea of stopping the quarrel by using chants?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this one was kind of new to me as well, but I think it's not something I use much, but I think if there's something like, should we go down Center City when we go to church, or should we take Route 2? And for some reason, we're arguing about it, and we can't have a decision. Maybe just make the decision based on a coin flip or something. I think that might be more applicable where like the result is going to be minimal. It's 1 minute difference or something. If it's a bigger decision, you probably don't want to do it on chance. So, yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I might not have the full context to explain it well, because they talk about powerful contenders, and that sounds like a little bit more of maybe a gladiator thing or something, so I don't know the full context. So it may be a little bit more specific in its application. But something that I thought I'd at least show as an option. I've never been comfortable using that before. So, yeah, hopefully that's helpful. All right, I think we are just about at time. One more? Yeah, go for it.
If you have time for one more.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is working. Kind of a follow-up question to Bruce's question about chance. I was wondering, where do you think having that mediator that you were talking about, like a pastor or a close friend, do you think that would come into play maybe more often than like flipping a coin, in regards to like having a a brother or sister kind of that knows you to help
Yeah.
resolve something?
Yeah, I would say, it's a helpful question, thank you. I would say flipping a coin may make the decision, but you may still have that conflict between you. So like you said, like bringing a mediator in, if you both are humble enough to ask for a mediator, that would provide route to solve the argument, the quarrel that might be happening. Yeah, so yeah, thanks. All right, that's all the time I have. So I'll pray quickly and then we'll go. Lord, thank you for your word and the amount and volume of things you speak to in our lives. We ask that you would help us learn to recognize the different states of conflict, and that we would, in the moment, be more aware of different options we can take, and that you would give us the power from your Spirit to take better options that would help resolve our own heart issues and the troubles we have with those that we interact with on a daily basis. In your name, amen. Thanks, everybody.